Alright, this is part two. If you're just showing up now and have not seen part one, go to the very end of this video and in your top left hand corner it'll show you part one there. You can go back to it. I apologize, and I really wanted to get this in one video. That never happens with me because I won't shut up. We just got through looking at the Badarian statues and stuff that they have in the Kata series people too, and then I showed ones that they have that have the blue encrusted eyes rather than the going look that was on that one that we were showing, and then leading into the earliest dynasties, crystal blue-eyed statues and everything else that goes along with it. And you can definitely tell what ethnicity the people were that finally made statues that you could good enough tell what's going on, right? Anyhow, so we're at Nakata, the earliest face of ancient Egypt. But perhaps they say the best researched of these cultures and the most important in the study of pre-dynastic Egypt is the so-called Nakata culture. Its earliest form emerged around 4000 BC and was also called Amratian culture, or Nakata I. Several things characterize this Chalcolithic culture, meaning they're coming into the Copper Age. Pottery became more advanced and trading was established between upper and lower regions of Egypt, leading to something eventually. Other trade was established with Nubian regions from where obsidian and gold were imported. And the people of this time weren't the people that we called Nubians, though. In fact, Nub is looked at as being gold. And they used to have a place down right near the Gulf that they called that too, in between the Nile and the Red Sea, that they called Nub. But it pretty much got picked out, but they knew there was gold up here too, and so they did. So when they say Nubians, they really didn't refer to them as necessarily that. They call them Nahasi. And Nubia is this area that's there, right? Later on, the Nubians that we know of come into that area, but they really don't show up in Egyptian history until way in the first dynasty at the end of it. And then they get killed off as Nubian Colony A and don't show up again in records for over 400 years easy as Nubian Colony C. But that's another thing altogether, for we're talking about the blue-eyed Caucasian Egyptians. Next step in Nakata culture is the Stage 2, also known as the Girzian culture. The Nakata II thrived from around 3500 to 3200 BC and was centered around Girza. This period was crucial in laying the foundations of the Egyptian civilization. Those amazing Caucasians. Nakata II was an unbroken gradual development from Nakata I, emerging in the Nile Delta and spreading through the Upper Egypt region. It is possible that it formed even before 3500 BC. So alongside a smaller Omari B culture, as they called it. Archaeological evidence of this culture displays new developments in ceramic ware with unique styles, iconic motifs, and natural imagery. This culture had all elements of a Proto-Egyptian civilization emerging, from first elaborate burials, necropolises, funerary items, and other elements coming into use. During this period, trades outside of Egypt's border became prominent. Evidence of trade with Sinai and Palestine are found, and a centralized power emerged. And whether at this time this centralized power emerged in one in the north and one in the south, or just this straight of central power they're talking about, for that seems to come just a little bit later. Pre-dynastic tomb sheds light on Egyptian life before pharaohs. If that's one I haven't commented on, or something that's in it that can be covered, I'll do one on that. And as the desert encroached more and more, these people became increasingly dependent on the fertile Nile Valley for their food source and raising of crops. This increase of food made a gradual shift towards a sedentary lifestyle, and Egyptians formed cities, some of which numbered up to 5,000 people here at first in the first little clusterings. During Nakata II, copper became widespread in use. Even though high-quality stone weapons were still fashioned, copper was also dominant. One of the greatest examples of pre-dynastic ceremonial flint weaponry comes from this period. It's known as the Gibel Arak knife. I've shown you that before and talked about how it has a symbology on its other side that's usually not shown of a master of beasts, and that goes with Sumerians. It's a ceremonial knife and made under strong Mesopotamian influence. Bam! With an elaborately carved ivory handle and an exquisite flint blade, it is important insight to the early relations between emerging Egypt and Mesopotamia, for they both had these reed boats and things going on. And there's all these other connections too, because in a short period of time, they end up having not just reed boats, but they end up having cuneiform writing. And it was used between them and the Mitanni and the people up around the Fertile Crescent. And so they all had this going on. Right? So it's an important insight, though, into the early relations between emerging Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so here's that Gebel Arak knife, and I wish they'd show the other side of it. From the other side, right here is a man holding up two lions. And so it's a master of beasts iconography and well-made blade. It's butterfly spun out here and everything, and kind of a ceremonial knife. And before they started making metallic blades, you can imagine how this would have been something super special. Look how huge it's flinted across the middle, and how the edges here have this flinting of the ridge point in every one of them into another V. And on this side, much like a serrated kitchen knife. It is these Mesopotamian influences that led to the theory that the Egypt of that period was ruled by a Mesopotamian ruling class. Although this theory is no longer supported by scholars, and strange, but there are scholars that do still support this concept, and the fact that, well, were they ruled by this class, or was this class somehow the people that got it up and going, and not that they were ruled from Mesopotamia, but they separated in the, like, Shimsu horror and the idea that went along with it. And did this come about before they're even thinking of it? Did, and it wouldn't take but a couple of 100 years, and then it would have been a disappeared idea. Some of these earliest tombs show you these boat battles and things that are going on, and a lot of people have made the connections, along with early cave art type looking things, wall art basically, in between the Red Sea and coming in Egypt, of people dragging boats and things that looks very symbolic of the first coming here. But the final stage of pre-dynastic period of Egypt, and the crucial part of its formation, in this the Naqada III period, also known as Dynasty Zero, are the proto-dynastic period. And so a further development of the preceding Naqada II. This period lasted from 3200 to 3000 BC and led right into the earliest dynasties. This period marked the height of the pre-dynastic Egypt striving towards a political unification and state formation, and the first mentions of the ruling kings of powerful regional political entities known as polities. During this proto-dynastic period, the first shapes of an emerging Egyptian civilization that we know today became visible and viable. The power polites, or polities, that arose in the valley of the Nile were city-states, with three most powerful ones being Thinis, Nekhen, and Naqada. And the one that rose on top from these three is the almost mythical Thinis. Thinis was a state that was attested in many ancient historical sources numerous times, but even so, it remains were never discovered, really. All sources and evidence point to a location near Abydos, another important Egyptian city. Some people believe it was rebuilt over the top of it, and it might actually be it itself. Others believe that we'll never find that city. Some believe that they took the city and dismantled it to make other cities like Abydos, and that's why you would see it there. So here's another palette that's found for it here. And this is the Bull palette. It's a famous piece attributed to the Naqada III period, proto-dynastic Egypt. So this looks like it's right before the Narmer palette and things, right? But in this, there are people being attacked in ropes, And here's that strange depiction I've showed in some of the other videos that I did one about Narmer palette and the whole descriptions about every little picture on it. And in that, there's this rope that's attached to by hands, but the hands are attached to staffs, and then there's standards for certain gods for each staff, and those are the ones that have the rope wrapped around the people that are no longer here. In this picture too, you can see it from one side. It looks like a man getting run over by a bull. On the other side, the same iconography, but you can see in this picture here, there is what looks like a lion over a bucket, and he's also trapped in something that looks like a swirled, niched architecture, almost a cogwheel and gear situation. So it looks like they already had their cosmography and everything all hooked up normal. They already have that, and it seems like the zodiac thing's somewhat in phase. And then here's another aspect of the bull of Hathor and so on. Appears to be a male bull, and that's signifying Leota Taurus, perhaps. So, uniting the two crowns of Egypt, then this became a center of the so-called Thinite Confederacy, a proposed tribal union that was one of the steps that preceded the unification of Upper Egypt. Themis managed to successfully conquer Akkad and unify Upper Egypt, and then it merged with Nekhen seemingly without conflict and conquered Lower Egypt. The rules of this pre-dynastic period are often termed as Dynasty Zero. Still, the pharaoh that is united under Lower and Upper Egypt in this proto-dynastic period is not known within certainty. Ancient Egyptian records mention this to be Menes, a ruler of whom no evidence exists. Thus, scholars believe that the unifier of Egypt was most likely Narmer. Narmer can be considered as the third Egyptian ruler whose name is attested to and evidenced after Eri, Hor, and Ka. And so people have thought that that may be him. And that was actually the person that did it. And there's other people that believe that, well, this little civil war fighting went on for quite some time and kind of back and forth a little bit, and then they unified. In fact, the fighting back and forth with each other strengthened themselves, and it did make the final thing a little bit tougher. But in that same statement, when they came together, they got to put the whole shebang together, right? So they got to put the ground beef in the chili, and here we go. So the most important evidence that supports the theory that Narmer was the unifier of Egypt is the so-called Narmer palette, one of the most important archaeological finds from Egypt. This siltstone palette depicts some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions and the earliest known depiction of an Egyptian king. On it, intricately carved scenes depict a victorious ruler, thought by most to be Narmer, in a dominant stance with a mace raised high above his head, ready to strike a kneeling prisoner. This is known as the Orion stance, and if you look at Orion the Hunter, this is mimicking that exactly, and they carry that stance all the way through Dynastic Egypt. On this side, the ruler wears the headjet, the white crown of Upper Egypt, but on the other side, they have the other one. So, pretty much that right there in itself was the reason that they put together and said that he's the one that had unified it. And the Menes thing, they have this one statuette head, and the guy found it in a Cairo market. There's no declamation on its age or anything in any way, shape, or form. Doesn't have the double crown on it in any way. And then people try to say, well, this is Menes and so on off of it, and there's no verification for that in any way. But if you want to look for somebody who might have really existed and so on, then you might look for Narmer. On the other side is a complex layered display of several scenes, the largest of which displays a victory parade. On this side, the ruler is displayed with the Desheret, the red crown of Lower Egypt. Interesting, Desheret is where we get the word desert from. And also with a mace and a flail, which are a traditional symbol of kingship in Egyptian art, which later becomes a crook and a flail, right? So it started off with maces, And the mace, in some strange way, ends up being turned into a scepter, if you will, right? But you see a crook and a flail in a lot of things. So, um, the fact that the king bears both crowns of Egypt, which combine to make up the Sekhemti or the Pishent, the royal double crown of Egypt that we're all familiar with. On the pallet is a carved serach, a heraldic standard that bears a puzzle, rebus, which shows a catfish and a chisel. The puzzle is actually a name. Catfish in ancient Egyptian was NR, while the chisel was MR. Together they form the phonetic representation of the name Narmer. And that's where it comes from. And they talk here of phonetic representation. It's the Phoenicians that brought a writing form to people that used the very first letter. We still do this to the day whenever you learn your ABCs, and A is for apple, and B is for ball, and C is for cat. And so if you wanted to say ABC, you would draw apple, ball, cat. Well, now we've gotten it stepped up a whole nother easier thing where we know A is A, B is B, and C is C, and so it phonetically works out to a whole nother level. And then the language that we're talking in right now works off of it fantastically. Although there's still a bunch of weird rules, isn't there? Mankind's development is observed. With the unification of Egypt and the establishing of the first kingdoms and the earliest dynasties, the official timeline of an ancient Egypt begins. The pre-dynastic period serves to offer us a perfect glimpse into the complex process of a developing civilization, a process that lasts for several thousand years or millennia. It shows us how different groups emerged and disappeared, and how each new century placed man one step ahead with new technologies and refined tools. That actually happened again when the Hyksos invaded and brought the wheel and chariots, horses, the recurved bow, and quite a few other things. And it really gave Egypt a second life, and you can see later how they're all of a sudden chariot happy. Step by step, century by century, millennia by millennia, the peoples that emerged in the desert regions of the Egypt and the fertile valley of the Nile built up a complex set of beliefs and myths, establishing technologies which would bring to life one of the most important civilizations in mankind's history. And it ranks very highly up there. But because it's so early, the only thing we had to compare it to for a long time was Sumeria. And Sumeria's kind of got this overshadow on it. People don't pay attention near as much. It doesn't have the glamour. But I've often said to some people whenever it gets to this point that if you just took the pyramids out of the situation and left everything else and really excavated Sumeria, you'd have a different idea. And if it was as open to us, instead of being in Iran where it is now and the problems there, and Afghanistan and so on, you'd probably think differently of the two. So I did it in the other video, and this one has only gone, 18 minutes? So let's do it one more time here. For the last one I messed up, and I wasn't even able to show you Yuya and Thuya. So I'm going to see, of course, there's those crystal blue eyes. And if we get here to the very end, oh my god, I've got so many things open, guys. But I have been able to take care of quite a few of them. So if we look at this, we can see the earliest dynasties they're showing, and they were pale women and red ochre males, and that's pretty much a Caucasian edict to keep her more pale and fair and all those things. And so the male gets somewhat tanned and the female stays pale, and you can see this iconography in Minoan art and Etruscans, the Mitanni, the Greeks themselves and stuff quite easily. So it's nothing that's soloed to Egypt in any way or should be thought weird and different for it being there. Here's Mitri, a scribe with those blue crystal eyes, and here's the seated scribe and so on that we looked at before, and here's Nofret herself. Here's a doll that has blue eyes, and blue eyes get around because Sumerian people and their priests had blue eyes. Egypt did, but even Peru and in India, some of the Buddhists have blue eyes, and there's a reason for that, and I've got videos out on that. We can't touch that now, but hey, here's something. Look at this, two statues in gold full with lapis lazuli eyes, Nakata 2 period, before the pharaohs. And who were they? These are Caucasians. You can tell from the phenotype, but also the blue eyes. And it's cool, it's like a bead that should be on a necklace, and they stick them in their eyes. But they're kind of teardrop shaped, so they fit right in. This is not that big of a thing, it's a couple of foot long. But then when you look at these crystal blue eyes that they inset in these guys and how it looks real. And in fact, the other cool part about it is not only just the eyes have a pocket behind it and a little space and then a thing drawn like the pupil, and so therefore it looks like the depth of a real eye following you around the room, but the whites are a special type of granite they found that has little pink veins in it. And so they make it out of there, and it really looks like the whites of somebody's eyes. It's an amazing realism, and these statues here were in the earliest dynasties, pretty much before they started making everybody a uniform look. And of course, scribes and people like that didn't necessarily have that done to them as the king did, because he became a god and had this icon to look like. Not very much variation on a theme. In fact, Akhenaten here was one that really messed that up. Oh, I was going to show you Yuya. Yuya. Blonde. Let's see how that goes. Yuya blonde. And so you'd think he'd be up there a little faster. So let's do this different. Let's just take off the blue-eyed effect or anything. Let's just go Egyptians. Yuya blonde. And yep, there's a good picture of him. Right there. Looking kind of like Abe Lincoln a little bit. We got blonde hair. Soft, curly blonde hair. Yeah, they look under a microscope, every one of them, from the earliest mummies they ever found. Here's quite a few of them, red and blonde and auburn hair. Hatshepsut herself, and what's known as the smiling mummy. But Ramses too, the Great himself. So there's quite a few of them. Seti and so on also. Here's Ramses here, and you can see his hair is done the same way. Of course, his had turned quite gray, and they say that they coated it whatever with the henna. Still, whenever they look at it under a microscope, can tell, hey, you used to have pigment into it where it was red. So, you know, and of course they try to say Yuya and all this. Well, here's her mummy with this long Caucasian hair. So that ends that ideal, but really that never had any real seriousness to it. But here's another picture of him, and if you look at it in black and white, that really does look like Abe Lincoln. But if we look at the picture over here, they cut off his hair as much as they can in a shot. But if you get somebody that got a good shot at him, you can see that blonde hair in there and how it looks a little bit like Abe Lincoln there. So, yeah, the earliest of dynasties, and now we looked at, you know, people and remains that they have said were Caucasoid from back at least 125,000 years, but carried that on through the people in time. And the one thing that's really kind of left out here is the Natufian type people who seem to have made a connection, and perhaps for the people that brought all of that grain and those cattle here, maybe in one or two waves. And those guys seem to be connected to Göbekli Tepe and Upper Anatolia, the Caucasus Mountain Range and Anatolia stuff, and Georgians and Mitanni and all those guys. And there was eventually a split that went from that, and one seemed to go above the Mediterranean, and the other one came straight down. And what's odd also is that some of those weird circle mounds they find in South Africa and that they've wondered about for a bunch of years, and there's hundreds of them, there's a group of them that they found over in Jordan look exactly like them. And the ones in Jordan have been excavated, or a couple of them been looked at. Now they need to start excavating them before they show up Natufians at quite an early age. And this might show the extent of how far up the Nile they went, and how far did those people trek in ancient times. There's the Hoffmeyer site way down in the Cape that shows about 38 to 40,000 BC Caucasians that are there. There's also a Blombos rock right down on the very Cape tip inside of a cave, and it's doesn't show any remains of people, but it's a red ochre setup site for them that's much like what it ends up showing later, and it's about 100,000 BC. So quite interesting. So now we'll get on to the next one. Enjoy. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Peace.